Greetings and welcome to this mini lecture on a brief history of comics part 2. In this mini lecture we're going to take a look at the emergence of the physical comic book, the emergence of the superhero, and how the superhero ultimately leads to the rise of horror comics, and how horror comics ultimately lead to a significant redefining and censorship campaign that is leveled at comics. So, if we're going to talk about comic books, we really do have to talk about Action Comics #1. It comes out in 1938. And while it's not the first comic book to come out, it is one of the most important. Because prior to this, there are comics that are coming out, but they sell, but they're not selling in any amazing numbers. There's enough to make money, but nothing to really make people think a lot about comics. And then Action Comics comes out. And we have Superman, and Superman is ultimately a game changer for comics. Superman is created by by Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster, and the two of them are teenagers at this point, and ultimately create. This is their third rendering of this character that they've been toying with for a few years. But Action Comics is in of itself not a Superman entire title. It was a variety comic. It had several other types of comics within it. And so each story would run for, it could be 4 to 16 pages. Superman would have a story, and there would be a Western, and then there would be a sports one, and then a comedy one. There's a real mixture of comics, of comic stories within. And it was published by National Allied Publications, which eventually becomes what we know today as DC Comics. Now, a couple interesting things to note about Superman's first appearance that people don't always get, and I think it's interesting given how much we think about him as a part of the American pantheon of legendary characters. First, that he's an orphan, both from Krypton and on Earth, right? So his parents have to send him to Earth, and when he gets to Earth, he doesn't end up with Ma and Pa Kent, he ends up in an orphanage. And I think it's a very telling thing in the 1930s that Siegel and Shuster, Siegel in particular, whose father was actually shot, and therefore, not leaving him entirely orphaned, but having lost a parent, that Superman himself actually doesn't have parents on Earth. What's interesting about this first issue is Superman as a character acts on several different levels. He acts on the local level. He basically beats up a wife beater. He acts on the state level, where he prevents a person from being committed to death row because that person is innocent. And he operates on a national level. He jumps over to Washington, D.C. to listen in on a lobbyist who's trying to manufacture a war. So what's fascinating is, very early on, his attempt to really, be that champion of the oppressed, the physical marvel who had sworn to devote his existence to helping those in need, is really quite true. I mean, he operates on the local, state, and national, or you could say international level, just within 16 pages. So he's a fascinating character, and he really does get the attention of lots of people. Within a few months of that, it becomes clear that Action Comics is selling like no other title. And so, of course, DC Comics, or National Allied Publications, quickly gives Superman his own title, in addition to having him regularly be in Action Comics. And one of the things we have to see is, as we get into talking about the presence of comics, Superman is a great case study because he ends up very quickly by 1940, right? He only comes out in 1938. 1940, he has the Adventures of Superman radio show. And this show will actually come to influence the comic because it'll be the first appearance of Jimmy Olsen and the first appearance and use of kryptonite. Superman also shows up in film serials, or he shows up in the Fletcher cartoons from 1941 to 1943, and that's enough to actually even spur Batman, who will come along in 1939. That's enough to spur Batman, who will come out with 2 live-action serials, one in 1943 and one in 1949. Superman also gets his first book in 1942, The Adventures of Superman by George Lothar. And elsewhere within popular culture or mainstream culture, Superman very quickly becomes a nationally syndicated comic strip. He appears in many daily and weekly comic strips throughout the country. He also appears in the 1940 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and they celebrate a Superman Day on July 3rd, 1940, at the New York, I believe it was New York or Chicago's World's Fair. Um, he is omnipresent very quickly. I mean, if we look at all of these dates, he is appearing in all forms of media within 4 years of his creation. And so I think it speaks a lot to the power of Superman and the power of comics, of how quickly comics explode and people are interested. And when I say people, yes, lots of children, but there were also lots of adults reading comics. It was easier for adults to read comics in newspapers because they could always say, I'm reading the newspaper, and that looks authentic, but there were definitely adults also buying and reading comic books. So we have this explosion of comics. Comics are really popular, people are reading them, and they're gaining people's attention, but as comics are largely dominated by superheroes, that actually starts to fade by the mid 1940s by the mid 1940s, and people are less interested in reading comics. There's another reason why comics start to fade, or at least there's some concern over comics as well. And that starts initially with Sterling North in May 1940. He writes an article called A National Disgrace, and he talks about comics as a hypodermic needle to the eye, and just how horrible they are. And he's the first well-known person to really start to criticize comics as some kind of cultural threat. But his work doesn't really disrupt comics in any significant way. My research has actually shown that, if anything, his biggest influence is probably getting comics to include sidekicks. I think that's probably his biggest influence with the article that he writes. But superhero comics, by the mid-1940s, as people are returning from World War II and have seen the real atrocities, they're looking for something grittier. And that eventually becomes crime comics, and crime comics eventually turn into horror comics. Superhero comics felt a little too optimistic, felt a little too strange to understand or to experience after the atrocities of World War II. Crime comics, it resonated with people, and there was a desire for justice. There was a desire for, processing a lot of the horrible things that people had been exposed to, and that crime comics eventually evolves into horror comics. And the horror comics become very, very popular, and so a lot of what we're talking about this week, they become so popular that, again, like Sterling North, other people rise up in concern about what comics are doing. And so enters Frederick Wortham, a name infamous within comic history among people that have studied comics or know about comics of the 1940s and 50s. And he writes a very exploitative, very highly dramatized book called Seduction of the Innocent. Now, he's a psychiatrist, and he has been working with juvenile delinquents for much of his life, and he makes the argument that we hear even today with video games or the internet or social media that, he worked with all sorts of juvenile delinquents. All of those juvenile delinquents do read comics and enjoy comics, therefore comics cause juvenile delinquency. And he makes a very compelling argument. He's very smart in that he has excerpts of it published in mainstream magazines that women read, like Home Journal or Home Journal and the like, where women are going to be reading that, and they're going to be home and they're going to go and empty out their child's collection of comics. So it was a very, very strategic placing of or use of the fear factor about teens, about kids. So With that comes the Comics Code Authority. As we'll see in the documentary, and as we'll talk about this week on while talking on comics, Wortham's work ultimately gets a hearing with the Senate subcommittee meeting on juvenile delinquency, and from that we get the comic industry creating the Comics Code Authority. And its power was to regulate comics and to keep horrible things from appearing in comics. And it gets ridiculous and it gets silly. You can't do things like have werewolves or have vampires, or you can't ever provide a story in which a icon of society, such as a policeman, a judge, etc., is shown in any negative way without being punished. What it really does, unfortunately, is that it infantilizes comics. And first, it causes, because of that Comics Code Authority, so many publishers that were solely focused on horror can't even produce their titles anymore. And if they cannot get the Comics Code stamp of approval, they cannot end up on newsstands. So many publishers close. But then the other piece of this is that censorship really does destroy the ability for comics to tell complex stories. So it's this self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, comics are for kids. We should censor them and not allow them to tell complex stories. Therefore, comics will always be for kids, and there's never an opportunity for comics to really tell powerful, meaningful stories that we've seen them be able to do in the last 30 or 40 years as that Comics Code Authority's power has lessened. So that's brief introduction to superhero comics and horror comics, and kind of where we set the scene for this week as we take a look at comics. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.